On this episode of China Unscripted, what the experts get wrong about communism, how American elite sold out the U.S. to China, and what we can do about it. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chung.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
And joining us today is Bill Gertz. He's the national security correspondent for the Washington Times and host of the podcast Victory Over Communism. Oh, Bill, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be on the show. Yeah, you guys do great work.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm really excited about this interview because we can kind of talk about some of the nitty-gritty ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, which we don't always get to do. The dirty reds, as I like to call them, Shelley. Did you know that?
Are you going to spend this whole episode baiting me?
So you talked about how the CCP believes in endless revolution. No, I don't want to start with that one. Sorry. What is the most misunderstood thing about China's brand of communism?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that for many years, I'd say almost 40 years, in the West, there has been a delusion or reluctance to recognize that China is even a communist state. That's changed radically in the past 6 or 7 years. But I can remember back in 2007, I did a debate in New York City on the question, booming China spells trouble for America. And I was arguing yes, and three others, pro-China debaters. It was an Oxford-style debate. We lost. But one of the pro-China debaters was a businessman named James McGregor, who used to head Dow Jones in China. And afterwards, he told me, I've been doing business in China for 20 years and I've never met a communist. And I told him, I said, you need to go, the next time you're in China, you need to go to the PLA Museum, the People's Liberation Army Museum, which I did in the late 90s when I covered the visit there of then Defense Secretary William Cohen. And in the museum, they have statues of all the leading communist theorists, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. And these are the underpinnings of Chinese communism. And again, for many years, the policy was hide and bide, bide our time, hide our capabilities, which also meant hiding the ideological underpinnings of Chinese communist behavior. And that has now been changed radically under Xi Jinping, who is adopting a new style of Marxism-Leninism that has elements of Chinese strategic culture, but more importantly, has key elements of Marxism-Leninism, which has, again, it's adapted. Marxism-Leninism doesn't work. And they've had to adapt it since Marx in the mid-1800s up until the current day. And now they're changing that in order to try and get traction for it and get traction for really the Chinese are out to control the world under Chinese communism. And this is a real danger. And this is what prompted me to launch the podcast literally 2 years ago this month. So I'm now in my third year. I've been it's called Victory Over Communism with Bill Gertz, and I've been relatively cautious about it because I anticipate a reaction from the communists, and I focus on two things: Chinese communist ideology as well as American Marxism, or neo-Marxism, as I call it. But for this program, I think we'll just focus on the Chinese side of it.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe we can get into all of it, but go ahead.
Well, you mentioned that there was this delusion, right, that China was not a communist or that they wouldn't talk about the ideology. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's because the CCP was so good at hiding the ideology, or was there something else going on?
Well, as I understand it and talk about it in my podcast, one of the key features of communism throughout its history since Marx and developed the ideas and Lenin put them in practice is deception. So they've used strategic deception. And this has been a factor in every element of communism throughout its history. For example, in the early days of the Soviet Union, when they realized that their Marxist economic theories were creating problems, Lenin did a big retrenchment, and he launched something called the New Economic Policy, which was basically a way to attract investment in capital. And that was where the phrase, the capitalists will end up selling us the rope that we will use to hang them. We're seeing a similar thing happen now. Since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, 2013, ideology has taken Marxist-Leninist ideology with Chinese characteristics, and we can get into that a little bit too, has been on the resurgence, and we've seen that their economy is going down. And we just saw a kind of new economic policy 2.0 with Xi Jinping meeting with U.S. Chief executive officers recently to try and attract them. And many of them sung the praises of China. Again, it's this idea of getting access to a market of 1.4 billion people.
Well, so do you think it's a situation where the Chinese Communist Party was reforming, was heading away from communism, and then Xi Jinping brought it back? Or was he just executing the plan that was there all along?
Every leader since Mao has had an adherence to the fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, which has, I think, basically in the Chinese context, has had basically 5 tenets of CCP ideology. And that is that the Communist Party is in an epic struggle with global world capitalism led by the United States. This is a key feature of it. And again, it was suppressed, obviously, when the relations back when the U.S. played the China card against the Soviet Union. It didn't change. It was a temporary tactic for them. The other element of CCP ideology is that there is a notion of the insidious peaceful evolution that U.S. policy towards China has, again, for those 40 years where we had our senior leaders telling us China poses no threat, or even I can remember Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice during the Bush administration said she favored a strong China. And the idea was that there was going to be a peaceful evolution politically if we just changed their economic system. And so economic engagement was tied to a hopeful but false political belief that China would eventually evolve into a non-communist, non-threatening power, and didn't happen. The Chinese leadership, again, from Mao all the way through Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and now Xi Jinping, have this idea that there is a perpetual revolution. They believe that there has to be perpetual revolution. It's part of communist doctrine, so that they are constantly working to advance the communist revolution. But of course, they obviously, for deceptive reasons, don't talk about it. And they also have adopted the Leninist notion of the weakest links of capitalism. That's the idea that initially, Marx and Engels said that communism would come about in the advanced developed countries. And Lenin said, no, it's going to come about in the less developed countries, Russia, China, South America, Africa, places like that. So the Chinese adopted that, and their communist view was that communism wouldn't come in the major cities, it would come in the countryside. So they replaced the proletariat with the peasant class. Under Xi Jinping, that's kind of been changed to with a tinge of Chinese nationalism, but it's not nationalism in the sense of wanting to make China great. It's nationalism in the sense that China must resume its place as the world hegemon, the world to dominate the world, which they believe is through Chinese strategic culture that is its rightful place. And so that's kind of the guiding ideology right now. So they've mixed Chinese strategic culture with which is a Chinocentrism, and also this idea that China is morally superior, so they can do no wrong. So when they're accused of stealing massive amounts of American technology, the Chinese response is this is totally false. The Chinese can do whatever they want. They also have the concept of under heaven, or Tian Sha, which means the whole world is really China's. They've made all kinds of historical claims. We've seen that in the South China Sea. Even the Romans never claimed to own the Mediterranean Sea when they were dominating the world. The Chinese claim that they own the South China Sea, and they make all these very vague historical claims. And it's all part of that strategic culture. And then the use of the ideology helps them to implement their plans for what will be, unless it's stopped, will be a world dominated by Chinese communism.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about the idea of endless revolution, because this is something that appears in a lot of communist ideology, not just the Chinese Communist Party, but you hear like Brazilian Marxist educator Paulo Freire talking about perpetual cultural revolution. Where does this idea come from? Because that seems insane to most people. I think the idea that you would be constantly in a state of tearing everything down.
Yeah. It comes from, Karl Marx gave a deadline for the demise of capitalism. He said that communism would inevitably take it over, and it didn't happen. So you saw Lenin then, his prediction was that, and Mao also, adopted this idea of perpetual revolution. And so it will be a long fight, and it will require forever. So in other words, they didn't set a timetable. So therefore, this was a key Leninist precept for power, maintaining political power. And of course, that political power gave them the ability to use ruthless, disastrous death and destruction policies. That's why we've seen 60 million Chinese who died under communism. You don't hear that in China today, but that's the estimate of the Black Book of Communism, the academics who studied this. It's the worst disaster in modern history that all of these people died. And the reason they died was because communists had ultimate power, and the ends justified the means. So all means were necessary to eliminate opposition to the vaunted class, which was led by the Chinese Communist Party.
So in terms of endless revolution, and one of the reasons why, as Chris points out, that's insane, is because the Chinese Communist Party, they wanted revolution. They used revolution to ultimately win the Chinese Civil War and take over China in 1949. But they don't want revolution inside China now, right?
Right, but yeah, they're using it to say that, again, in Marxism has shifted from first the workers, then the peasants under Mao. Now it's the Chinese nation that they use as the vaunted class that must be that the world is against China. Therefore, we have an endless battle against world capitalism. And this is a constant refrain from CCP propaganda. We see the idea that the CIA is working to defeat the Chinese Communist Party through color revolutions and through other means. And so this gives them great power to suppress every scintilla of dissent, or even the perception of dissent or opposition to the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese people do not want the Communist Party in power. It's this elite that has designated themselves as the vanguard of the world revolution, which is going to replace the US-led free and democratic system with the Chinese system. They honestly believe that, and Xi Jinping did his doctoral dissertation on scientific socialism. There's actually nothing scientific about Marxism, Leninism, absolutely nothing. And in fact, Marxism-Leninism, and this is a key element of my counter proposal, it's kind of a quasi-faith. You must believe in these tenets, and anybody that disagrees with it has to be treated as a heretic and basically destroyed.
Well, I think this is the issue with, why there's so many people who look at China today and say, "Oh, it's not communist." Even today, people say that, and I think it's because communism it can keep changing. It's like magic tricks, sleight of hand. It's like so Marx talks about, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and the workers will seize the means of production. Mao talks about the peasants and the landlords. Today American Marxists will talk about, frame it as racial dynamics in the United States. So everything keeps changing. How would you define this Marxism communism to somebody that like makes it identifiable?
Yeah, I would define it as basically an anti-human ideology. And of course, ideology in the Western sense is kind of a form of ideas that motivate government. But in the Chinese context, it's actually regarded as kind of a consciousness. So it's infused the ruling party, which is now boasting, I think, 98 million members. Again, this is not the whole country. I mean, the average Chinese, they're not interested in the ideology. They'd rather live a prosperous, free life. But the party sees itself, and especially now under Xi Jinping, they've revitalized Marxism-Leninism and they're dropping their bide our time and hide our capabilities strategy. And they're openly declaring. In fact, the most recent episode of the podcast, I went to the website of the Central Party School, which is now publishing online its ideological journal called Chu Xi. And in this, they list, they had an article on Chinese diplomacy, and they listed a number of things. But the key thing that has changed for them is they're starting to talk about how Chinese ideology is not just for the Chinese people, it's for all mankind, all humankind. And so they're beginning to demonstrate that they are on the march and that China must reclaim its place as the middle kingdom under heaven, that they are the dominant nation. And again, they're struggling against the capitalist world that they think is unfairly treating China and the Chinese people. They try to conflate or conjoin the idea of the party and the people. And that was one of the most important policy changes that was made during the Trump administration, where the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, began to distinguish between the Chinese people and the ruling Chinese Communist Party that ruled over the Chinese people. That was one of the most opposed positions during the Trump administration. And Pompeo told me when I interviewed him a couple of times, he said, when the Chinese were coming to him to complain about things, that was at the top of their list, that they really disliked this idea that they weren't that the Chinese people and the Chinese party were not one and the same. And I remember that too. A number of years ago at the Washington Times, where I worked, a PLA colonel came to visit me. He was visiting some think tank, and he came to me, and I explained to him, I said, look, my position in reporting is that I'm not against the Chinese people. I'm against the Chinese Communist Party. And he vehemently objected to that. He said, no, you are anti-Chinese people. So that is one method that they use to try to discredit their critics and opponents.
I do think that in the West, in America, we don't really understand how pervasive the ideology is, like the Marxist-Leninist ideology in China. I think because there's not something comparable in the U.S. I mean, when you, like, in your elementary school in China, like one of the first songs you learn to sing is, without the Chinese Communist Party, there would be no new China, right? Like, it is embedded in the education. Like, you have to take Marxist-Leninist, like, theory classes in starting in elementary school, you have to pass that section of the college entrance exam to be able to get into college. And I think it's easy for us to just be like, okay, well, sure, they say they're Marxist Leninists. Like, there's all this kind of fuddy-duddy, like, language, ideological language in their documents, but does that really mean anything? Does that actually translate into the actions of the CCP?
Yes, absolutely. This is, and it's very similar to what took place at the start of the Cold War when we had the famous X article, which called "The Sources of Soviet Conduct," which basically said that what the Soviets were doing was based on their ideology. A similar occurrence is now. We're seeing the sources of Chinese conduct are its ideology. It's not divorced from that. And yet, we in the West don't come from the same ideological culture. We have an innate sense that people tell us the truth all the time. And so it's very difficult, I think, for Americans to comprehend this. And the other problem is, again, it goes back to the China card during the Cold War, where the U.S. was engaged in a difficult regional war in Vietnam, and we were able to reach out to the Chinese Communist regime, which again was struggling to survive basically in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. And the Chinese and the U.S. were able to cooperate. We even had an intelligence base inside of China which monitored Soviet missile fields in the eastern part of the Soviet Union. But then what happened was, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, this pro-China policy through people like Kissinger and others who believed that, who decided that we were going to ignore Chinese ideology and its crimes against humanity and its activities in order to have personal relations. So personal relations between U.S. and Chinese leaders became a dominant feature of our China policy, for great disaster, in my view. And so this policy kind of went on and again. And I remember the thing that kind of got me going on this back in the late 90s. I went to the Defense Intelligence Agency for a briefing on the Chinese military. Back then, they used to give reporters background briefings. And I went for this briefing on the PLA, and it was fairly vanilla. And at the end of the briefing, a colonel came in and said, "The general would like to see you." And okay. The general was the director of the DIA. And we sat in a windowless conference room, and the director of the DIA said to me, he said, "Bill, China's not a threat." And I said, "Well, what's the basis for your conclusion of that?" And I'm paraphrasing it, but he basically said, "Because they told us they're not a threat." And I mean, obviously, he was trying to spin me as a reporter, but the fact of the matter is that China has gone to great lengths to deceive the United States and the West. And they've done that through this personality-driven policy where they had people come and try to make relations with the leadership and ignore the ideology and its consequences. So we changed that during the Trump administration when China became first a strategic competitor. Now it's still a strategic competitor, but we need to understand that it is an ideological adversary, an enemy, and it wants to destroy the United States. The sole impediment for Beijing to achieve the China dream under Xi Jinping's reckoning, and that's based on a PLA colonel named Liu Mingfu, who wrote the book, The China Dream. The main impediment to China achieving its dream is the United States. Again, and the reason is that the United States is the leader of world capitalism that must be defeated.
Can you give an example of how that type of ideology, the idea that the U.S. must be defeated as the leader of world capitalism, translates into something that China's doing, like, policy-wise?
Well, I think, all you need to do is look at their cyber attacks and their nuclear buildup. Those are two elements. They regard the United States, again, as a declining power. That's part of their ideology. And it's based on historical materialism, which is the false doctrine that history is moving inexorably towards an ideal worker's paradise, or in the Chinese context of Marxism Leninism, it's the concept of national rejuvenation. National rejuvenation meaning that the Chinese culture will dominate the world because that's where it always has been. So historical materialism, as I point out in the podcast, is not accurate. That it's based on a secular view, and the secular view doesn't understand the spiritual aspect. And I know that this may be a different point of view, but my approach to countering Chinese ideology is to recognize the spiritual nature of humans, whereas communism views humans as basically matter in motion with no spirit. And that has been the source of great, great problems. And we're seeing that play out in Xinjiang and Tibet, where a genocide is underway. These are policies based on their ideology that says these are opponents to our ability to achieve our global objectives. And so that's, I think, would be a clear example of that.
What you're saying kind of reminds me of the ThreeBody Problem, which is, I know you're looking at me like, why am I bringing this up? But in the second book, one thing that happens is like
no spoilers for the nice people.
Well, I need to make my point.
Okay.
All right, so fast forward if you don't want a spoiler here, but in the future, like the world is like this. Everything is socialist, and people don't really have to work if they don't want to, but also people are like, really unhappy because they don't have any reason to live. But that's not the point. The point is that there's this idea that in the future things will be socialist, and because that's where history is inevitably moving towards, right? Which is dumb because it won't work. But I can see how if you believe as a Chinese Communist Party that socialism is ultimately the future of everyone, then of course every free market country like the United States is in decline, whether they recognize it or not, right? And I think they've used that to convince a lot of people in the West that because socialism is of course the future, and the United States isn't socialist enough yet, that the U.S. is in decline for that reason, unless it becomes socialist.
Yeah. Yes, of course. And there are many people in the United States that are working along those same lines. And I've pointed that out in the podcast. For example, the Communist Party USA for decades was an appendage of the Soviet Communist Party. Well, guess what? They've realigned now with the Chinese Communist Party, and they're working together with them ideologically to promote this idea. This is the most powerful aspect of communist ideology, is that it provides a vision. But the problem with that vision is that it's atheistic and unspiritual. It doesn't recognize some very deep truths, which is that history is not a secular movement from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. It's a providence of restoration. And the communists believe that they can change human nature by imposing this external force, the power of the party, which Lenin was instrumental in introducing. So we have Marxism as the theoretical, philosophical side, and Leninism as the practical implementation side. That vision is very powerful, but in my VOC worldview that I present is that history is a providence of God, a restoration providence, where the problems of society are actually problems of human nature, and that there's a contradiction within people, and that has to be addressed in order to solve the problems of the world. But again, This is a very powerful vision that has deceived millions and millions of people around the world.
Well, I mean, is it even possible to change human nature? Because, you know, yes, communists believe that they could do that. This idea that, oh, everyone will just work for the greater good, from each according to ability, to each according to need. But it turns out that human nature does not work like that. And when you put people in that situation where they receive the same benefits regardless of how much they work, they just on average, not everyone obviously, but on average, people work a lot less. They don't work nearly as hard. They don't care as much about their jobs, and overall productivity falls dramatically. And at the same time, people don't really want to be equal. If you're at the bottom, you want to be equal because it allows you to rise up. But if you're at the top, you don't want to be equal with everyone else. And so what happens inevitably in all these communist systems is that, there becomes an elite group that gets, if it's not money, it's at least benefits. They get a car that's paid for by the government, a better apartment that's paid for by the government. They get, a better job or position that's paid for by the government. So there's still this elite class that emerges because that's natural in human nature. And so is, working to achieve something for yourself. And you can argue whether that's good or bad, but that is how humans work, right? And so isn't communism kind of showing that they're not actually able to change that?
Yeah, they're saying that if you just change the economic system, that will solve all the problems. And we know that that's not true. I would go back to Jesus, who said, "You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." Whether that's possible or not, you can debate that, but it clearly identifies that the problem is much deeper than the economic system. And yet, that vision, this idea of an ideal world under communism, is so powerful. But yet, those of the faith, most of the world's faiths recognize that the human nature problem is really the root of it. And then once you solve that, then we can have somehow an ideal society down the road. But without that spiritual aspect, what we're going to see would be a world dominated by a system that has a body count in the tens of millions, if not even more, or scores of millions. Yeah, it won't be a good world if the Chinese Communist Party takes over the world, as they're claiming to do in their internal ideological writings.
Well, this is the problem with absolute materialism, which, it reduces everything to just atoms bumping around. And so if you look at everything in the world as being essentially scientific, that means everything can be measured and quantified and then controlled.
Yeah.
And so people in power, this is when you get German political sciences, German social sciences, the idea that you can, even with human behavior, quantify it, measure it, and ultimately control the outcome. And so this is the idea that society will evolve along these paths until you reach socialism, eventually communism. And as you mentioned, this is pretty pervasive. Klaus Schwab, WEF, World Economic Forum, famous for, in 2030, we will own nothing and be happy. Never be happier. He was one of the earliest people pushing for economic relations with the Chinese Communist Party. I think in 1978 or 79, he invited Deng Xiaoping to speak at Davos. He didn't attend, but then he went to China. So how much of a problem is it that there are these people in the West, we'll call it the West, who also believe that inevitably, because of this historical evolution of society, the U.S. is in decline, capitalism cannot continue, and there will be this greater Star Trek utopia?
Yeah. I think that's one of the key idea problems facing us, the idea of scientism, that unless you can measure it, weigh it, and apply theories to it and prove it true, that it's not true, that there is no truth. I think we're really talking about trying to define truth. In the communist sense, they define truth as whatever they will serve their purpose of advancing their regime. But there are things that we can't measure scientifically. For instance, the concept of love, those kinds of things, the nature of God. Although science today is beginning, you get to the Big Bang theory, and scientists They can't explain infinity. They can't really explain, what came before the Big Bang theory, the creation. But my view is that we've got to get, and again, science is working to be able to come up with the spiritual aspect of nature. I mean, there are all kinds of things where we're starting to do that. And once we do that, that is ultimately going to be the key to defeating the materialist, atheist, communist system.
Yeah, the example I always give is like, science is good and all, but if your marriage is falling apart, it won't help you. There's more to human experience than scientific materialism.
Yeah, and of course, this the battle for truth, even scientific truth. When the idea that the sun revolved around the planets, and they said, no, it's the planets around the sun. It didn't go well at the time. There was a lot of opposition to that. Even Einstein, said that he relied on intuition to advance his theories of relativity, and he's probably done more for physics than anyone. Now we're into the quantum phase, and again, I don't quite understand quantum, but it does seem to me to be coming a kind of a new understanding of the nature of the universe and how it works.
Well, I've always believed the universe revolves around me.
You and the Chinese Communist Party apparently agree on that one.
Yeah. So then, if this is a bigger global ideological struggle, what's the solution?
Well, yeah, like I said, we're at a disadvantage in the West in that we don't have an ideology like Marxism, Leninism, which again provides an extremely powerful basis for actions. And again, it's catching on. I mean, you can declare that there are multiple genders, but the truth is there are only two genders, male and female, and that's a fundamental truth. But these fundamental truths are being attacked. And until we can come up with some clear way to understand that, and again, I try to do this in my counter proposal during the VOC podcast, as I call it. And I think that's really the key, is try to educate people to make them aware, first, of the fallacies of Marxism, Leninism, communism, and then what are some of real world solutions to the problems that communism is seeking to address.
Well, so earlier you mentioned, you described communism as an anti-human ideology. What makes it anti-human? What's anti-human about the oppressors standing up to the
Oppressed.
What's anti-human about the oppressed standing up to the oppressors? What's anti-human about China standing up to American imperialism?
Well, yeah. First of all, the human has, if the human is simply another form of animal, then you can rationalize and justify any kind of horrible action. But if a human has both a physical body and a spiritual body, which again is a concept that I advocate, then it has a totally different value. And the value, again, is the human's relationship to the creator. And that's really the key. So when you remove that value, that human value, which has an eternal value, and just say that it's matter in motion, that's where the crimes of communism. And this was something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn produced in his landmark work, The Gulag Archipelago. He pointed out that the Soviet system was an anti-human system because it was based on the idea that people are not really human in the sense they're just another form of animal rather than being a child of the creator.
Well, I think that's a very good example, a very good explanation of why the Chinese Communist Party is so threatened by the United States. Because at the United States core is the idea that we have inalienable rights that come from the creator, that these rights are something transcendent, that they aren't given by a government, that can be taken away or given whenever they want. And that's the world the Chinese Communist Party wants, something that's a world run by bureaucracy that can make the decisions for people because there isn't anything that exists outside of humanity.
They're essentially people become cogs in the socialist system, right?
Yep, atoms bumping around.
And that is the main contribution of Vladimir Lenin to communism. That, the theories of Marx and Engels were philosophical foundation, and Lenin said, look, only a ruthless revolutionary vanguard party can do history's bidding. Again, history being this nebulous, unguided movement from feudalism to communism ultimately. And the Chinese have perfected that. They've used their high technology to enhance party control and to almost nearly eliminate dissidents. I call it high-tech totalitarianism that you see today. Not only can China recognize people by their face, they have the capability to watch how people walk, their gait. And this is an extremely powerful control mechanism. And also they control information. So when you control the information, you can prevent people from understanding what's really going on. And they've achieved a degree of control that is unprecedented, I think, in history, and it's increasing. They're using that not only domestically to control the Chinese population, but now we see that more so in the United Front Work Department influence operations, which are reaching extraordinary levels. And the West has really no defense against that because they haven't been able to fully recognize the danger posed by this ideological threat, as I call it.
Well, I was thinking about something when you were talking earlier about one of the tenets of the CCP's ideology is that they are in this struggle between Chinese communism and the West capitalism, and that there must be perpetual revolution, like all these things. And then from the U.S. side, let's say the U.S. State Department saying like, oh, well, we don't, like trying to say we don't want to contain China, like we don't have a containment policy for China. We want China to be part of the, international order, to be like a responsible party in the international order, essentially we want to engage this kind of stuff. But then does that, like, it doesn't seem like that is compatible with the CCP's ideological framework of how they understand the world.
Yeah, John Garneau, the Australian sinologist, put it very aptly that the Chinese approach to dealing with the United States is we live, you die. It's basically they have a Chinese phrase for it. Whereas publicly they're talking about win-win, which wags have said, oh yeah, the Chinese win twice. Even the Biden administration just recently, in the phone call between President Biden and Xi Jinping, we learned this from Chinese state media, not from the White House readout, but Mr. Biden again repeated, which other senior officials have too, that the United States does not oppose Chinese communist system. They basically accept it, and they want to try to compete with it, but they're not competing with it. So they don't fully understand the power of the communist ideology in China and it's their ability to influence and act in ways that are against what's happening in the country, and they don't understand it. They said they don't want a Cold War, but at the same time, the military has told us that China is engaged in what they call gray zone warfare, which is basically warfare below the kinetic level. And we see that against allies like in the South China Sea most recently. We see it against Taiwan, where they're using massive military coercion on a daily basis. We see it towards Japan. And the U.S. strategy has been to try and get allies together. But unless there's a stronger ideological component, if we recognize that this regime in Beijing does not want to compete with us, this is not the Indy 500 where you're going to have a race and the winner will race. They're working to achieve global dominance at the expense of the United States, and that's not fully recognized yet. I mean, it needs to be recognized. So we need to go from strategic competitor to understand that the Chinese Communist Party is an adversary of the United States. During the Trump administration, I had a friend in the State Department, Miles Yu, who's one of the best China experts, and he was one of the top policymakers. And I said, what the State Department should do is to do a white paper on the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party to educate people. And of course, it was resisted and opposed by the bureaucracy, which said that they couldn't do that. They couldn't do it, right? And so that effort was subverted. But that's kind of what's needed. We need to have a full record, and something like that could be the basis for changing the policy. And making a policy that would really be effective. But as long as the U.S. is going to try and coexist with the Chinese Communist Party, we're going to be at a major strategic disadvantage.
Yeah, what occurs to me with that whole line of, we don't want to, like, we just want to compete. We are not a threat to the CCP. We're not trying to contain you or your system, is that the CCP doesn't believe it at all. But then internally, like the U.S. starts to believe it. You know what I mean? Like if the State Department says this over and over again, then what do the people who are, in the think tanks, like coming up with policy within the administrations, like they're like, okay, well, we don't want to challenge the CCP essentially. Like that's our stated goal, right? So instead, in a way, we are making ourselves weaker and not convincing the CCP of anything.
Yeah, and there's even a kind of self-delusion about this notion of containment, which this is one of the key Chinese Communist Party tenets, is that the U.S. is engaged in an insidious effort to create the peaceful evolution out of communism, which is basically anti-communism. But at the same time, we're aggressively pursuing our allies who are very fearful of the expanding power of communist China. And we're doing many, many things defensively and in ways that clearly are an effort to contain this China. Containment has the tinge of the Soviet Union, which was much more expansionist. In the Chinese Communist Party's view, they're using their economic power now. And we see a number of initiatives which are all designed to fit the China Dream scenario or Xi Jinping's global hegemony scenario. They have the Belt and Road Initiative, again, which is couched as a infrastructure development plan in the developing world. They have the Global Security Initiative, which again is to try to set up police stations, Chinese police stations and others, and do security cooperation. So they have a number of these initiatives, all of which are ideologically driven, and yet we haven't really been honest with the people of the United States or the people of the world that these are, again, nefarious programs designed to weaken and undermine the free and democratic system that the U.S. is currently leading.
Well, I think the idea about the white paper kind of exposing everything the Chinese Communist Party has done is a great idea, because what I don't get is how we can use Klaus Schwab again, or people like that, these kind of fellow travelers who, like anyone who likes the idea of the sort of socialist Star Trek future, how do they ignore the Chinese Communist Party using rape as a form of torture, organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners and Uyghurs? How do they overlook all of these horrible things and think, this will get us to a world where everyone is equal?
Yeah. The combination of factors, I think there are certainly Marxists who view China, which again is one of the key tenets of Chinese communism, is that China is the last savior of world socialism. And so there are people that agree with that view. There are others who are more business or financially oriented that just say, they're still stuck with this idea that if we just trade and invest and do business with them, that capitalism will have a moderating influence. And again, we saw that was an utter failure for 40 years. So those are kind of combination of things. On the policy perspective, there's this idea that, oh, let's just coexist peacefully with this communist superpower, and without really understanding what their goals are. It's partly an intelligence failure, and I've reported on this a lot in my Washington Times reporting and in my books, that our intelligence agencies really have failed miserably for the last 30 to 35 years in assessing China. I can remember the Pentagon, which was required under federal law to produce an annual assessment of the Chinese military. And for many, many years, they presented a false picture of the Chinese military as limited, as unable to fully function, as being poorly structured, and as only being focused on developing forces for taking over Taiwan. And that view, I mean, if someone were to do an analysis now, that view is totally wrong. And you have to wonder, well, I know why part of that was the answer, and that was that inside the Defense Intelligence Agency, they had a Chinese spy. His name was Ron Monteperdo. He was never charged with spying, but he was charged with and convicted of mishandling classified information, and he had close ties to two Chinese embassy military attachés who he allegedly provided this information to. So that's kind of how the DIA director back in the day, and back in '99, told me that China is not a threat. Well, this spy case came to light several years later. That's not an isolated example. China has used its intelligence services to penetrate all levels of the U.S. government. They've penetrated the business community. We see that in Hollywood, where they've been able to influence films. Most recently, they tried to make a remake of Red Dawn, where instead of the Soviets and Cubans invading America, it was the Chinese People's Liberation Army. And China pressured the studio to change in post-production the identity of the military from China to North Korea, which kind of like made it like The Mouse That Roared, the movie of the Duchy of Grand Fenwick invading the United States and winning. And that shows you the kind of power they have. Now, Hollywood has pushed back on some of the demands, but again, Hollywood wants to gain access to the Chinese movie market, so they've been censoring and modifying their movies so that they will comport with Chinese propaganda and Chinese information warfare narratives.
So in the Cold War, it seemed like people in the U.S. knew about the threat of communism. They could talk about the dirty Reds, and good eye roll. And now it's like people either they have the opinion of like I've done business in China for 20 years. I've never met a communist.
Yeah, that's been a problem in the U.S., being able to deal ideologically with communism. And part of it is due to the excesses of the McCarthy period, where anti-communism was largely discredited in a lot of ways, even though in retrospect, the communist threat was real. But there were excesses, and that became what I call the era of anti-communism, where the public narrative had been so powerful that if you were an anti-communist, you were actually worse than a communist. And that was really destructive of our ability as a nation and culture to really understand this ideological threat. And I think that's where a lot of our problems emanated. So, again, my VOC podcast, I'm trying to get back to saying, hey, look, we got to look at this. If we don't understand it, it's like James Carville said of politics, it's the economy, stupid. I'm saying it's the ideology, stupid. We've got to understand the ideology, not only understand it, we've got to go beyond anti-communism. We've got to provide that vision that communism is providing in order to ultimately defeat this false and destructive ideology.
That's a good point, because fundamental to communist ideology is that all of human society is moving towards something. And that's more appealing than, hey, we're at the end of history. Keep doing business, I guess.
Yeah. Well, in my counterproposal, I try to put a really modern view of comparing the two, historical materialism and God's providence. And it's very powerful in giving people an understanding that, hey, if we get back to this understanding of the spiritual nature of people and the universe, that we can ultimately come to the real truth. And it won't be a truth that changes from, the working class to the peasants to Chinese nation, as the or the oppressed versus the oppressors, as the neo-Marxists like to say. And I think that that's something that's urgently needed. So let's have a debate. And I think in the debate over that issue, I think that the truth will out.
Now, for a lot of Westerners, they're not really spiritual or religious. So how would you describe why this Western, I guess, vision of the future is better than the socialist vision of the future?
Well, even people of conscience who are non-believers can come to understand the fallacies of communism, because basically it doesn't work, and we've seen that, and we're starting to see it now in China, where they're saying, okay, we really were communists all along, and we're going to start following the ideology. We're going to start imprisoning entrepreneurs and taking their money, and look what's happening. The economy's kind of going downhill. And so that's yeah. So even people of conscience, I think, can come to understand the fallacies of communism, and then maybe they can look for some other alternative that will seek that. We don't really have that. Like I said, there's no democracy and freedom are not really an ideology that can go up against this powerful Marxist, Leninist, materialist ideology.
I guess it's interesting because, democracy, it's essentially a secular worldview. Communism is a religious ideology,
It's
essentially.
philosophical. It has philosophical roots. Yeah, and again, they're obscurantist in the extreme. If you disagree with them, you'll end up making sneakers in the Laogai, or worse. You'll be disappeared in their system, and we're seeing that in China today, and again in Western China and in Tibet, and against believers in China as well. So I think, again, education's the key, and countering their narratives. Again, not enough has been done. I think Australia kind of set the model probably about 5 or 6 years ago, where they did a big study of Chinese influence operations and uncovered PLA members in the actual parliament. And it had a major impact on their policy towards China. We still haven't done that. We're still in the debate phase, where we have our CEOs going to Beijing and praising Xi Jinping, whereas others are our ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, coming out and criticizing harshly the Chinese Communist Party. So the debate is not settled. So let's get going on the debate. Let's keep the debate going. Congress has been doing a little better. I think the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party is a really good start. They've done some admirable work. I've urged them to address this ideology issue. They have not really focused on the Chinese ideology and the danger that it poses. That's something that urgently needs to be done. Mike Gallagher, who's stepping down as chairman, is going to be replaced. So hopefully the new select committee chairman will be able to do something. We've got to address this issue. It's not going to go away, and it's going to become a bigger problem in the future.
Well, you said that China portrays itself as the last savior of socialism, communism. But this ideology is all over the world. If we do manage to defeat Chinese communism, is that really a death blow to the ideology, or will it just persist?
Well, I think the Chinese people ultimately can take care of them. And I remember a recent interview by the Chinese dissident Tsai Xia, who was a member of the party school and defected a number of years ago. And she gave an interview recently to The Wire China, and she said it requires external pressure, that obviously change and getting rid of the Chinese Communist Party has to come from within China. And there are differences within the Chinese leadership. And she talked about how many years ago there was an opening up, there was debate, there was some ability to challenge. And I can remember as recently as 2012, the Chinese internet was very vibrant with opposing views, and that all ended under Xi. He imposed draconian ideological controls, and she defected, and now is speaking out about how I'm not sure she has abandoned communism, although she's made it clear that she doesn't believe in communism anymore. And she was, again, a person at the Central Party School, which trained all of the Chinese leadership. But she said that we need external pressure. And I'm not seeing that external pressure. Just from the Biden-Xi phone call, it was again a lot of the Chinese narratives and talking points, which feeds their United Front work department powerful influence operations around the world. So we've got to push back harder, and we've got to get information into China. Now, technology could help that. Perhaps Starlink. The Chinese are very fearful that the U.S. will set up a Starlink that will allow people in China to directly connect outside of the Great Firewall of China. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be doing, and we're really not doing them.
I hope Elon Musk would be into that.
Not
But with all those
hold
Tesla
my
factories in
breath.
China,
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
I was just thinking, like, under Xi Jinping, people point to things getting worse under him, more draconian, more authoritarian. And I was just imagining, like, I can't imagine a parallel universe where Bo Xilai made it to the top of the party.
And it was better?
I can't imagine it being better.
No, I mean, he also was doing a lot of like Maoist stuff when he was in charge of Chongqing, right?
And in Dalian, lots of organ harvesting.
So, yeah.
Yeah, the Bo Xilai case is really fascinating. At one point, he claimed to have control over one of the group armies. And that, I think, was really raised the eyebrows in Beijing, and that kind of set in motion. We haven't really heard the full story of the battle between Xi Jinping and Bo Xilai back in the day, but it'll probably it'll eventually come out, I believe, and we'll find out what went on. I know from the Tiananmen papers that there was a real push for a democratic political reform in China. And of course, after Tiananmen, the Tiananmen massacre, that political reform was completely obliterated. And Sai Xia, the dissident party school person, she talked about that after that, the party was frantic. How do we train our cadres, and how do we eliminate this move for democracy in China? I think it's still there. I think it's underneath. It's been suppressed, but we need to help revitalize that in China.
Someday, Taiwan will take back the mainland, West Taiwan. Bill, this was a very interesting interview. I think one of my favorites. And we'll definitely put a link to your show, your podcast below. I encourage everyone to check it out.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been great having you on.
Great. Well, great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad we could get into the weeds of ideology.
Yeah, it was interesting how he was talking about sort of the excesses of McCarthyism kind of backfiring and creating this anti-communism. Do you think calling them dirty Reds is one of the excesses?
I believe that's my entire argument against saying things like that.
No, that can't be right.
Say things like what, Shelley?
Nice try, Matt.
Could have done a supercut right there.
Yeah, I mean, that's my argument against saying that term, is that it immediately...
What term?
Not gonna say it.
Okay.
I mean, but like, it is that, yes, like the idea that now you are the bad authoritarian one, right?
It's a witch hunt. They're just innocent
I mean, some people were innocent. That was the problem, right? That Bill Gertz was alluding
Oh,
to.
nobody's innocent, Shelley.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so what's interesting about that is the whole, McCarthyism and the excesses of that leading to the anti-communist movement is that that's when communists took advantage of the Western system, right? Which is like the anti-communists recognized that one of the problems with communism is that it is unfree and you have no freedom, for example, to say what you want. And that's true. But the communists took advantage of that and they're like, hey, well, if you say that we can't have communism, then you're violating free speech. And therefore, it's totally okay to be communist.
I mean, I think now I'm just thinking about TikTok.
Right, like their whole free speech argument.
Yeah.
But it's a bogus argument, right? Because forcing TikTok to sell to a non-Chinese company is not the censorship of American speech. It's simply the changing or potential ban of a platform that's controlled by an unfree country, which will lead to more free speech, perhaps, but at a minimum, it's not actually preventing people from saying what they want or punishing people for saying what they want on social media.
I hope that U.S. senators agree with you.
I hope so too, because it is unclear whether that's actually going to pass.
I think they're going to hold a hearing on it. The chair of the Senate Commerce Committee or something like that said that she had some free speech concerns.
Right.
So they're going to have a hearing about it. It's not going to pass as quickly as it did through the House.
That's certainly the case, yeah.
Oh, dear. Well, I'm sure there's massive lobbying going on behind the scenes.
Yes, a lot of TikTok lobbying. Yeah, I mean, we talked about Jeff Yass, the guy the Republican super donor who also funds a lot of the Club for Growth stuff. And Politico had an article out the other day that said that the Club for Growth was telling Republican senators that they might have to lower their score on the Club for Growth site. They rank, and they have scores for senators, and they allegedly that they were saying that they might have to lower the score for people who would vote for the TikTok legislation.
So basically, it's the social credit system applied to U.S. senators.
Of course, the Club for Growth denied it and said that, the Politico's reporting was wrong and taken widely out of context, et cetera. Yeah.
We didn't threaten the senators. We just told them the fact that we were going to lower their scores.
Yeah. It's amazing how that is so pervasive. It goes back to this materialistic, measuring things. We create these metrics that we can measure people on and use that as a way to beat you into submission. It's very similar to ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing, which China has taken advantage of over the years.
Yeah, I love how they've taken advantage of oh, look at China. We're producing all of this electric cars and solar panels and we're so green. You should work with us to fight climate change. And then obviously they, make solar panels using ethnic slave labor and
that's okay because that's not measured by ESG.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So what gets measured gets, tracked and changed and people work towards it. And what doesn't get measured just falls off the wayside. And if we had a score, if the US government had a score for human rights, we kind of did actually in the 90s when every year the Congress had to determine what kind of trading status we were going to have with China.
I mean, I believe they always gave them most favored nation anyway. But
they did. But I mean, at least there was some kind of metric. But there needs to be a metric for human rights. And then there will have to be either conformity to that or there's consequences. And then it's something that's actually positive for humanity to measure.
I mean, I think that there was, I don't know if a metric is the right thing, but with things like the Magnitsky sanctions, there was the acknowledgement that if you do bad things, human rights wise, then there will be consequences.
Yes.
And which now is making me thinking about a lot of Hong Kong groups have come out to essentially criticize the Biden administration for, Article 23 was just passed in Hong Kong, and the Biden administration did not like we have Magnitsky sanctions in the U.S., so they could have put Hong Kong officials or Chinese officials who were involved on the sanctions list, but they chose not to. That they said that there would be visa bans, but they weren't going to publicize who the visa bans were going to be for.
Mm-hmm.
But like the Hong Kong groups were basically saying that this is toothless because, first of all, you're not going to say who's getting visa banned, but also like these people were probably not coming to the U.S.
Right.
So whereas like if you actually did what they did to like then Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam, like stopped her from being able to like
To use the global banking system.
so she had to be like keep lots of cash around
Right.
because she couldn't, and that is actually like a consequence. But like, doing the kind of like quiet thing coincidentally at the same time that Biden was having a chat with Xi Jinping on the phone.
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing is not really standing up to the CCP.
Yeah, that was the thing about those sanctions. Like it gave the U.S. president a lot of leeway in who he could sanction. Like it was kind of up to the president at the time. And one of the criticisms before it was completely rolled out is that Trump will just use it to, sanction a nobody because he just wants to do business or have good relations with China. But he used it on like it was devastating. It was actually Biden the one Biden did keep all of those previous sanctions in place, but he definitely did not end up using it to full effect when he was apparently telling Xi Jinping, don't worry, the U.S. isn't going to challenge China's communist rise.
Well, I think that's one thing interesting that I got from what Bill Gertz was saying is that no matter how much you say that you're not going to challenge them, the CCP fundamentally believes that you're challenging them, and they will never disbelieve that because that is how their entire system is built.
It's baked into the ideology.
Yeah, like it's
Basically, their
baked into
projection, right?
it is their projection, but also like if your entire survival is based on the idea that there is the enemy that you're fighting and that enemy is the U.S., like the U.S. telling me, we're not your enemy, what difference is that going to make?
It's inevitable social historical forces at work. It doesn't matter what you say. It's inevitable. Yeah, which I do think was very interesting. Bill talking about like the need for a spiritual alternative, which actually reminded me a lot of an episode I did on Deep Thoughts While Gaming, where I talk about really weird philosophical or spiritual things by tying it to some video game.
Was there a particular episode you were going to talk about?
Yes, it was about Mass Effect.
Okay.
I'll put it in the link, but I'm sure you two have never played it. But I'll put a link to that below. It talks a lot about that. And like the idea of like historical materialism and that maybe that isn't what's going on in human history.
So for all of you watching who love 1-hour podcasts and also video games, click the link below.
I think we found from the last time we asked about this, actually more people than I expected in the comments say they watched both Gamers Unbeaten and China Unscripted.
You guys are cool.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I guess with that, we have nothing more to talk about. Wait, I have something I could say. I did like Matt's... Did you roll your eye? No. Okay. I did like Matt's idea of like a human rights rating on China. I think that would be good to have like a very nice visual metric, maybe like, a color scale where, green is good and goes all the way to dirty red. Thank you for watching China
I should have rolled my eyes though.
Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganese.
And I learned nothing.